In recent days, the Department of Justice has reignited national debate after sending a 6-page letter to Congress outlining its latest redactions related to the Epstein files. The letter was presented as a move towards transparency, a formal response to mounting public pressure to release more information about the case that has shadowed Washington for years. But instead of providing clarity, the release has raised a new set of questions. At the center of the controversy is a compiled list of government officials and politically exposed individuals whose names appear somewhere within the thousands of pages of Epstein-related documents. On its face, that sounds significant. After all, any association with Jeffrey Epstein immediately draws public attention. However, the real issue is not simply who appears on the list, it's how those names were selected and what their inclusion actually means. According to the DOJ's own explanation, an individual was included if their name appeared at least once anywhere in the documents. That threshold is remarkably broad. A name could show up in an email header, inside flight manifest metadata, within a customs record, or even in a news article attached to a document for reference. In other words, the presence of a name does not automatically imply wrongdoing, and that distinction matters. For example, if a newspaper article discussing Epstein also mentioned a former president in an unrelated context, that name could be included in the compiled list. If someone had a brief email exchange years before Epstein's criminal conduct became widely known, their name might qualify. If an official referenced Epstein while investigating him, that mention alone would meet the criteria. Yet the DOJ did not separate those categories. Instead, the department merged every qualifying name into one unified compilation, without differentiating between incidental mentions and potentially meaningful connections. Critics argue that by doing so, the DOJ created ambiguity rather than clarity. When all names are placed on a single list without context, the public is left to interpret the significance on its own. That opens the door to speculation, partisan spin, and media sensationalism. Supporters of the department counter that it fulfilled its legal obligation by disclosing names that appear in the records. They argue that further categorization could raise privacy concerns or compromise ongoing legal considerations. But transparency is not only about releasing information, it's about releasing it in a way that allows the public to understand it accurately. Right now, that understanding is limited. The broader concern is that this release shifts attention away from more substantive questions, such as prosecutorial decisions, immunity agreements, and investigative discretion, and toward a headline-driven debate over whose name appears more frequently. Instead of discussing why certain materials were redacted, the national conversation quickly pivoted to comparing political figures. Predictably, commentators on both sides began highlighting names aligned with the opposing party, while defending those on their own side. The result is a familiar pattern, a partisan tug-of-war that generates heat but not clarity. And that may be the unintended consequence, or perhaps the foreseeable outcome, of releasing a list without explanation. To be clear, appearing in documents tied to Epstein does not equate to criminal involvement. That principle must remain central. The presumption of innocence applies universally. A name alone proves nothing without context, but context is precisely what is missing here. Were some individuals investigated and cleared? Were others simply referenced in passing? Did any have documented, sustained contact? Were certain decisions influenced by legal strategy, resource constraints, or something else entirely? The DOJ's letter does not answer those questions. It simply confirms that names appearing at least once were included. That leaves the public with a compilation that feels significant, but lacks explanatory framework. And in today's political environment, ambiguity rarely remains neutral. It becomes a catalyst for narrative building. Another layer of complexity involves timing. The Epstein case has long symbolized concerns about elite accountability and preferential treatment. As a result, every disclosure, partial or complete, carries amplified weight. When expectations of transparency are high, incomplete context can intensify skepticism rather than alleviate it. The American public has consistently demanded clarity. Who knew what? Who was investigated? Who faced consequences? Were prosecutorial standards applied evenly? Those are structural questions, not partisan ones. Yet the current format of disclosure risks diverting attention from those structural concerns toward a scoreboard-style debate over political figures. It is entirely possible that the DOJ intended to comply strictly with legal obligations while avoiding overinterpretation. But compliance alone does not automatically produce public confidence. Confidence requires explanation. Without distinctions between incidental reference and substantive association, the list becomes a blunt instrument. It generates headlines, but not necessarily understanding. This raises a broader issue about how transparency should function in high-profile cases. Is releasing raw data sufficient? Or does meaningful transparency require interpretive guidance that helps the public distinguish between levels of relevance? In complex investigations involving thousands of documents, nuance matters. When nuance is removed, perception can quickly outpace fact. And that is where the debate now stands. The DOJ has released names, but it has not clarified what those names signify. Until that clarification comes, if it comes, the conversation will likely remain fragmented, driven by political reflexes rather than structural evaluation. The Epstein case continues to loom over Washington, not simply because of the crimes involved, but because of what it represents. Questions about influence, accountability, and equal application of the law. Releasing a list without context does not resolve those questions. It may, in fact, deepen them. And that sets the stage for the next issue, the redactions themselves and the legal privileges used to justify them. While much of the public attention has centered on the released list of names, a deeper and potentially more significant issue lies within the redactions themselves and the legal justifications used to defend them. In its letter to Congress, the Department of Justice stated that no materials were withheld based on embarrassment, reputational harm, or political sensitivity. On its face, that assurance appears strong. It suggests that the department is not shielding individuals simply to avoid controversy. However, the same letter confirms that certain communications and materials were redacted under claims of legal privilege, specifically deliberative process privilege and work product privilege. To understand why that matters, it's important to unpack what those terms mean. Deliberative process privilege is designed to protect internal government discussions. The idea behind it is straightforward. Policymakers and prosecutors need space to debate options candidly before decisions are finalized. If every internal memo or preliminary discussion were immediately public, it could chill honest dialogue and impair decision-making. Work product privilege, on the other hand, protects legal strategy, the notes, impressions, and tactical considerations prepared by attorneys in anticipation of litigation. Both privileges serve legitimate purposes within the legal system. They exist to preserve the integrity of decision-making and legal preparation. But in high-profile cases involving powerful individuals, the invocation of privilege can create tension between confidentiality and accountability. Because when redactions involve discussions about whether to charge someone, decline prosecution, grant immunity, or negotiate non-prosecution agreements, the withheld material is not trivial. It goes directly to the heart of how justice was administered. Critics argue that while the DOJ may technically be operating within established legal boundaries, the broader public interest requires a higher level of explanation. For example, if internal communications reveal debates about charging decisions, and those communications are fully redacted, the public cannot evaluate whether those decisions were applied consistently. If emails discuss immunity agreements but are shielded under work product claims, citizens are left wondering whether preferential treatment occurred, even if no such treatment actually did. In other words, redactions may be lawful, but they can still fuel suspicion when context is limited. Another flashpoint in the debate involves requests to release unredacted communications between Epstein and associates that reference prominent political figures. During public exchanges, calls were made to disclose those communications in full. The response cited privilege. This exchange quickly became politically charged, but beneath the rhetoric lies a substantive question. Where does legitimate legal protection end and public transparency begin? The DOJ insists that its privilege claims are standard and necessary. That may very well be true. Yet the Epstein case is not a standard case in the eyes of the public. For many Americans, the case symbolizes broader concerns about elite accountability, about whether wealth and influence alter legal outcomes. That symbolism magnifies every redaction. Even routine privilege claims can appear suspect when layered onto a case already surrounded by mistrust. At the same time, it is essential to maintain balance. Appearing in documents does not equal criminal conduct, nor does the existence of redactions automatically imply wrongdoing. Legal processes often require confidentiality at various stages, but the credibility challenge for the DOJ lies in perception. When a list of names is released without context and key communications about prosecutorial decisions remain hidden, the information gap becomes fertile ground for speculation. Political commentators have already filled that gap. Debates have shifted toward comparing high-profile figures, arguing over who appears more prominently in the records. Yet that debate may obscure the more fundamental issue. The core question is not which political faction has more names referenced in documents. The core question is whether the system operated impartially. Were charging standards applied evenly? Were investigative leads pursued consistently? Were immunity agreements granted based on objective criteria? Those answers cannot be determined from a name list alone. They require insight into prosecutorial reasoning, insight that currently remains redacted.
Supporters of the DOJ would argue that releasing internal deliberations could undermine future cases and compromise the department's independence. That concern is not insignificant. Prosecutors must maintain discretion and avoid setting precedents that could weaken their ability to function. But transparency and institutional integrity are also essential pillars of public trust. The American public has demonstrated repeatedly that it can handle complexity. What erodes confidence is not complexity, it's opacity. When information is released in fragments, citizens are left to assemble conclusions from incomplete pieces, and incomplete pieces rarely produce stable narratives. Another dynamic at play is the role of partisan polarization. In today's environment, even good faith disclosures can quickly become ammunition in broader political battles. The DOJ may have anticipated that releasing a categorized breakdown of names would ignite intense reaction. Instead, it chose a broad compilation approach. But broad compilations without explanatory guardrails carry their own risks. They transform nuanced records into binary headlines, and once headlines form, reintroducing nuance becomes difficult. The Epstein case has endured for years, not only because of the crimes committed, but because of the lingering perception that powerful individuals may have escaped full scrutiny. That perception cannot be resolved solely through partial releases or carefully worded letters. It requires clarity about process, clarity about standards, clarity about outcomes. The DOJ now faces a pivotal moment. It has disclosed names, it has outlined legal justifications, but it has not fully bridged the gap between disclosure and understanding. Until that bridge is built, debate will continue, not necessarily because of what has been revealed, but because of what remains unclear. Transparency is not merely the act of releasing information. It is the act of making that information comprehensible. A name without context is incomplete. A redaction without explanation invites doubt. A privilege claim without boundaries raises questions. The American people are not simply asking for documents. They are asking for confidence in equal justice under law. And confidence requires more than compliance. It requires clarity. Until that clarity emerges, the Epstein files will remain a symbol, not only of past wrongdoing, but of ongoing questions about accountability at the highest levels.